Did any African Americans travel with the Lewis and Clark expedition? Yes. We present York, the forgotten hero. York. Let's learn about his journey. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson commissioned a westward expedition across the United States after the $15 million Louisiana Purchase. Captain Meriwether Lewis and then Second Lieutenant William Clark were selected to lead the journey across the nation. The journey became known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition, also called the Corps Discovery. Although not highly publicized, an African American man by the name of York accompanied the group across the newly acquired land. He did not do so as a volunteer, but as a slave. The main purpose of the expedition was to map the new territory, study the area's plants and animal life, and geography to learn how the land could be exploited economically. Another reason was to establish an American presence in the new territory before any other European powers tried to claim it. Another goal was to establish trade and sovereignty over the indigenous nations near the Missouri River. What do we know about the African American man that traveled with the Lewis and Clark expedition? What we do know is that he was born in 1770 in Virginia. His immediate family consisted of his mom, Rose, his father, Old York, his sister Nancy, and brother Yuba. He eventually died in 1832. York was the childhood companion and personal slave of William Clark. In 1785, he and his family were forced to move to Kentucky with the Clarks. York grew up as a hunter and a woodsman, and ideally, the skills he learned in his youth served him well during the most prolific exploring adventures in the history of the United States. The journey across the nation would take York and the crew more than 8,000 miles from west of the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean and back again. During the journey, Lewis and Clark kept meticulous notes that often included York's personal adventures. Just like the unpredictability of ocean waves, York's life was turned upside down during the time he spent on the expedition. It was customary for slaves to be considered inferior and subservient to whites. In many ways, York lived a different life while on the journey. January 20th, 1805, Clark wrote that when establishing relationships with some of the indigenous people, York prepared fruit and stewed tea for some of the ill Native American men, and that he was the principal caregiver for Sergeant Floyd, one of the major expedition members who fell ill during the trip. York was not only a caregiver for the men, but he had other skills that he utilized during the trip. On June 5th, Clark wrote, "York swam to the sandbar to gather greens for our dinner." Apparently, Clark had fallen ill, and York was sent to gather nutritious food for Clark and the other travelers. York often utilized his skills as a hunter. On September 9th, Clark wrote, "I directed my servant York with me to kill a buffalo." York also killed elk and other small animals. Although York was used to hunting and gathering food and even being a caregiver, he was given other responsibilities along the way. York went out on scouting trips and ventured out alone to trade with the local village members. On several occasions, York's presence secured the success for the band of travelers. York was often front and center to assist Lewis and Clark in negotiating with the indigenous people. When the expedition needed horses to cross the Rocky Mountains, the Shoshone were unwilling to barter with Lewis until they got a glimpse of the black man York. Clark wrote in his journal about the peculiar treatment of York by some of the native tribes. The Nez Perce called him Raven's son. for his color and the mysterious nature that he embodied. The Hadasta chief named Labarge tried to rub the black off of York's skin, thinking it was paint. Clark wrote, "York pulled a knife on that chief." York was often on the front lines when encountering the natives throughout the trip. And when the Corps Discovery reached the Pacific Ocean, all of its members voted on where they would spend the winter, including York and Sacagawea, who is a Native American woman traveling as an interpreter with the men. The captains had a practice of naming geographical locations after prominent people connected to the trip. Clark named 2 geographical features after York. The first was a group of islands located in Montana. The second feature named for York was called York's Dry Creek, which was a tributary of the Yellowstone River located also in Montana. However, the name did not stick and soon became known as Custer Creek. Despite the success of the trip and York's prominent position while on the journey, unfortunately, the return home was not a positive experience for York. All of the other men of the Corps Discovery received money, land, and accolades upon their return, except York. Despite the significant role he played during the expedition, York was forced to fulfill his normal duties as a slave. He did not receive money, land, or congratulations for a job well done. So what happened to York? Claims were made that Clark eventually freed York, but no papers have ever been found showing that that actually occurred. Zenas Leonard, a famous explorer, wrote in his journals, Narrative of Adventures of Zenas Leonard, that in 1834 he crossed paths with a black man living among the Crows in north-central Wyoming. Perhaps we will never really know York's true fate. What we do know is that people eventually began to recognize and pay homage to York for his contributions made during the Lewis and Clark expedition. Eventually, several plaques and markers and statues were erected to commemorate York, along with the other members of the Lewis and Clark expedition. In 2001, then President Clinton posthumously honored York by presenting him with the title Honorary Sergeant, Regular Army. York was the first African American man to cross the continent, and although relatively unknown, was instrumental in the success of the exploration. Remember his story.